The sun blazed mercilessly over forward operating base Phoenix as Captain Della watched 920 soldiers march toward what would become the deadliest trap in modern military history. In 6 hours, she would defy every order, ignore every protocol, and pilot her Apache helicopter through a gauntlet of enemy fire that military strategists called impossible. What happened next would rewrite the rules of combat aviation and prove that sometimes the most underestimated warrior becomes the one who saves everyone else. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. Captain Della stood barely 5'4" in her flight boots, her blonde hair pulled back in regulation style as she watched the morning briefing from the back corner of the operations tent. At 26, she was one of only 3 female Apache pilots stationed at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, positioned in the volatile Kandahar province. The morning sun cast long shadows across the compound, and the air already shimmered with heat that promised another scorching day in the Afghan desert. Della had been flying Apache helicopters for 4 years, but her combat experience remained frustratingly limited. While her male counterparts flew close air support missions and high-risk extractions, she found herself assigned to reconnaissance flights and equipment transport. The official reasoning was always the same: resource allocation, mission requirements, operational priorities. The unofficial reasoning whispered in the mess hall was simpler. She was too small, too cautious, too much of a liability in high-stakes combat situations. Her Apache, tail number 847, sat pristine on the tarmac because it rarely saw the kind of action that left aircraft scarred with bullet holes and scorched with rocket burns. Della maintained it obsessively, running diagnostics that weren't required, practicing maneuvers during her off-duty hours, and studying combat scenarios that she was never assigned to fly. Her crew chief, Sergeant Kumar, often joked that her helicopter was the cleanest bird on the base, though he said it with respect rather than mockery. The other pilots respected her technical skills. She could thread an Apache through terrain that made seasoned aviators nervous, could place a Hellfire missile with surgical precision, and knew every system on the aircraft better than most maintenance crews. But respect for competence wasn't the same as trust in combat. When the shooting started, when soldiers' lives hung in the balance, the mission commanders consistently chose pilots with more combat experience, more physical presence, more of whatever indefinable quality they believed was necessary for war. Major Harrison, the squadron commander, dominated the briefing with his characteristic intensity. Maps covered the table showing troop movements and enemy positions across a 20-mile stretch of hostile territory. Intelligence indicated that insurgent forces had been consolidating in the region, but the exact nature of the threat remained unclear. What was clear was that a significant operation was being planned, one that would require every available resource. Della listened as assignments were distributed among the pilots. Captain Rodriguez would provide close air support for the main assault. Captain Thompson would handle battlefield reconnaissance. Captain Williams would stand by for emergency extraction if needed. Each assignment carried weight, responsibility, the chance to make a difference when it mattered most. Della's name wasn't called until the very end, and when it came, it carried the familiar sting of limitation. "Mitchell," Major Harrison announced, consulting his clipboard, "you'll be running supply drops to Outpost Bravo, medical supplies and ammunition resupply, standard transport mission." Standard transport mission. The words landed like a physical blow. While her colleagues prepared for combat operations that would test their skills and courage, she would be flying boxes from point A to point B, safely behind friendly lines, contributing nothing to the real mission. After the briefing, Della walked across the tarmac to her Apache, her flight suit already beginning to stick to her skin in the rising heat. The aircraft stood ready, its angular profile and stub wings loaded not with the Hellfire missiles and 30mm cannon rounds that defined its lethal purpose, but with cargo pods filled with medical supplies and basic ammunition. It was honest work, necessary work, but it wasn't the work of a combat pilot. Sergeant Kumar was performing a pre-flight inspection when she arrived, his experienced hands moving over control surfaces and weapon systems with practiced efficiency. He looked up as she approached, reading her expression with the intuition of someone who had worked with frustrated pilots before. "Another transport run?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Medical supplies to Bravo," Della confirmed, pulling on her flight gloves with more force than necessary. "Apparently that's where my unique skills are most needed." Kumar paused in his inspection, studying her with eyes that had seen 20 years of military service. "Captain, can I speak freely?" Della nodded, appreciating that Kumar never treated her differently because of her gender or her assignment limitations. He judged pilots by their competence and dedication, nothing more. "I've worked with a lot of aviators. Most of them know how to fly an Apache. Some of them understand how to fight with one. But you, Captain, you think like the aircraft itself. You see things that others miss. Understand connections that escape pilots with twice your combat experience. The day will come when that matters more than anything else." The words carried more weight than Kumar probably intended. In a military culture that often reduced capability to simple metrics, physical strength, combat experience, aggressive confidence, he saw something different. Della appreciated his faith, but faith wouldn't get her assigned to missions that mattered. That required proving herself in ways that the current system seemed to be designed to prevent. As she completed her pre-flight checks, Della's mind wandered to the intelligence briefing she'd been studying in her spare time. The insurgent activity in the region showed patterns that troubled her, coordinated movements that suggested something larger than the scattered attacks they'd been dealing with for months. The terrain analysis she'd been conducting showed potential vulnerabilities in their defensive positions, choke points that could become death traps if exploited properly. But intelligence analysis wasn't her assigned role, and unsolicited strategic opinions from transport pilots weren't welcomed in the planning process. The irony was not lost on her that she spent more time studying the tactical situation than pilots who were actually assigned to combat missions. While her colleagues relaxed between flights, Della pored over satellite imagery, weather reports, and enemy movement patterns. She'd memorized every landing zone within 50 miles, studied the ballistic characteristics of every weapon system in the enemy's arsenal, and developed contingency plans for scenarios that military planners hadn't even considered. Nobody asked her to do this preparation. Nobody knew she was doing it. But Della had learned that being ready for opportunity was the only way to create it, and someday, she was convinced, her moment would come. She just hoped that when it did, she'd be skilled enough, prepared enough, and strong enough to prove that size and gender meant nothing compared to competence and courage. As the sun climbed higher into the cloudless sky, casting the base in harsh, brilliant light, Della fired up her Apache engines and prepared for another routine supply run. She had no way of knowing that in less than 6 hours, 920 soldiers would be trapped in a killing field, and every assumption about her limitations would be shattered forever. The flight to Outpost Bravo took 43 minutes across terrain that Della had memorized down to individual rock formations and dried riverbeds. The Apache handled beautifully in the clear morning air, its twin engines providing the steady thrum of power that she'd grown to love over 4 years of flying. Below, the Afghan landscape stretched out in harsh beauty, all ochre mountains and shadow-carved valleys that had witnessed countless conflicts throughout history. Outpost Bravo sat on a strategic ridge overlooking 2 converging valleys, its position chosen for observation and defense rather than comfort. The small garrison of 60 soldiers had been monitoring insurgent movement for weeks, reporting increased activity but nothing that suggested an imminent large-scale threat. Della's supply drop was routine maintenance of their operational readiness, the kind of mission that kept remote outposts functioning but rarely made headlines. As she approached the landing zone, Della noticed details that wouldn't appear in any official report but spoke to her growing tactical awareness. The defensive positions showed recent reinforcement. Sandbags had been repositioned, and communication equipment had been upgraded. Someone at Bravo was taking the increased insurgent activity seriously, preparing for possibilities that higher command seemed to consider unlikely. The unloading process took 20 minutes, during which Della chatted with the outpost commander, Lieutenant Morrison. He was a competent officer with the weathered look of someone who'd spent months in the field, and he treated Della with professional respect that she didn't always receive from rear echelon personnel. "How's the situation looking out here?" Della asked as her crew chief supervised the supply transfer. Morrison glanced around to ensure their conversation remained private before responding. "Honestly, Captain, it's got me concerned. We're seeing coordination in insurgent movements that suggests something bigger than harassment raids. Pattern recognition indicates they're positioning for a significant operation." Della's interest sharpened. This aligned with her own analysis of intelligence reports, patterns that she'd been tracking but had no official forum to discuss. "What kind of operation are you thinking?" "If I had to guess," Morrison said, lowering his voice further, "they're setting up for a major ambush. The terrain in this region offers perfect opportunities for trapping large forces, and our patrol patterns have been predictable enough to exploit." The conversation was interrupted by a radio call requiring Morrison's attention, but his words stayed with Della as she completed the resupply mission and prepared for return flight. His concerns echoed her own analysis, suggesting that the current military assessment might be dangerously incomplete. Unfortunately, tactical insights from transport pilots and remote outpost commanders carried limited weight in strategic planning discussions. The return flight to FOB Phoenix gave Della time to process Morrison's information alongside her own observations. The insurgent activity patterns she'd been tracking suggested a sophisticated operation in planning, something that required coordination and resources beyond typical harassment attacks. But voicing these concerns would require her to admit that she'd been conducting unauthorized intelligence work. The military's hierarchical structure demanded that insights flow through proper channels, and transport pilots were not considered appropriate channels for strategic intelligence, regardless of their actual competence. The system seemed designed to waste capability in favor of rigid role definitions. That evening, Della sat in her quarters reviewing the intelligence reports that she'd been collecting. Satellite imagery showed insurgent positions that formed a pattern invisible to casual observation, but obvious to someone who'd studied the terrain extensively. Communication intercepts suggested coordination between groups that had previously operated independently. Supply route analysis indicated preparation for sustained operations rather than hit-and-run attacks. Everything pointed toward a significant operation in planning, but presenting this analysis would require her to admit that she'd been conducting unauthorized intelligence work. The military's hierarchical structure demanded that insights flow through proper channels, and transport pilots were not considered appropriate channels for strategic intelligence, regardless of their actual competence. Della faced a choice that would define her military career. Either accept the limitations others placed on her role or continue developing capabilities that might someday prove crucial despite current dismissal. She chose preparation over acceptance, understanding that being ready for opportunity might be the only way to create it. The next morning brought news that would validate her concerns in the most terrible possible way. Major Harrison's confident dismissal of threat assessments would prove catastrophically wrong, and Della's unauthorized intelligence work would become the difference between rescue and massacre. But that morning, as she prepared for another routine supply mission, she had no way of knowing that 920 soldiers were about to march into the deadliest trap in modern military history, and that her inappropriate expertise would become their only hope for survival. 3 weeks after her dismissed conversation with Major Harrison, Della had settled into a routine that looked ordinary but was anything but. Her official duties remained unchanged, routine supply runs and equipment transport missions that kept her Apache in the air but away from combat operations. What her superiors didn't know was that each flight had become an intensive training session designed to push her skills far beyond standard requirements. During her assigned routes to remote outposts, Della practiced tactical maneuvers that weren't part of any training manual. She would approach landing zones using terrain masking techniques that kept her aircraft invisible to enemy observation until the last possible moment. She practiced rapid assault descents that could deliver troops or supplies under fire and developed extraction procedures for contested landing zones that required split-second timing and absolute precision. Her crew chief, Sergeant Kumar, initially questioned these unconventional approaches, but Della's explanations convinced him that advanced training was always worthwhile. What she didn't tell him was that she was preparing for scenarios that military planners insisted were impossible or unnecessary. Every maneuver she practiced was designed for operations that command believed she would never fly. The most intensive part of her preparation happened during off-duty hours. While other pilots relaxed or caught up on personal correspondence, Della spent her evenings in the base's technical library studying attack helicopter tactics from conflicts around the world. She analyzed after-action reports from pilots who had flown rescue missions in hostile territory, learning from their successes and failures to develop her own tactical philosophy. Her approach to combat aviation differed fundamentally from the aggressive, direct assault methods favored by most attack helicopter pilots. Where they relied on overwhelming firepower and speed, Della developed tactics based on precision, stealth, and psychological warfare. She studied how Apache helicopters could use terrain and timing to create maximum tactical effect with minimal exposure to enemy fire. The technical manuals became her obsession. Della memorized the ballistic characteristics of every weapon system in the Apache's arsenal, understanding not just how to fire them, but when to fire them for maximum psychological impact. She learned how to use the aircraft's advanced sensor systems to gather intelligence while conducting seemingly routine flights, building detailed tactical pictures of enemy positions and capabilities. Her intelligence gathering went far beyond what was expected from a transport pilot. Della had developed a comprehensive understanding of insurgent tactics in the region, studying their communication patterns, supply methods, and operational preferences. She knew which groups worked together, which leaders commanded respect, and which tactical approaches had proven most effective against coalition forces. The maps in her quarters told the story of her dedication. Standard navigation charts had been overlaid with tactical analysis, showing potential ambush sites, defensive positions, and escape routes throughout the region. She'd identified every piece of terrain that could provide cover for a downed aircraft, every ridgeline that could mask an approach, every valley that could become a death trap under the wrong circumstances. Her physical preparation was equally intensive. Della had always maintained excellent fitness standards, but she pushed herself to levels that exceeded military requirements. Her cardiovascular endurance allowed her to function effectively under the physical stress of sustained combat operations. Her strength training focused on the specific demands of helicopter combat, building the core stability necessary for precise weapons operation while maneuvering aggressively. The psychological preparation was perhaps most important. Della studied combat stress management techniques, learning how to maintain tactical awareness and decision-making capability under extreme pressure. She practiced visualization exercises that prepared her mind for scenarios that command insisted she would never encounter, building mental rehearsals for operations that existed only in her imagination. The weapons training extended far beyond standard requirements. During personal time at the firing range, Della practiced with every weapon system available to Apache crews, developing proficiency that exceeded many combat veterans. She understood not just how to operate the systems, but how to maintain them under field conditions, how to troubleshoot problems that might arise during extended operations, and how to maximize their effectiveness in non-standard situations. The communications equipment received similar attention. Della studied radio procedures and encryption protocols that would allow her to coordinate complex operations across multiple units. She learned how to establish communication networks in areas where standard military communications might be compromised or unavailable, developing backup methods that could maintain coordination during the chaos of combat operations. Her navigation skills reached levels that impressed even seasoned pilots. Della could navigate accurately using dead reckoning techniques that didn't rely on GPS or electronic navigation aids, skills that might prove crucial if sophisticated enemy jamming disabled standard systems. She'd memorized landmark references throughout the region, creating mental maps that allowed her to operate effectively even if all electronic systems failed. The medical training was entirely self-directed, but potentially life-saving. Della studied advanced first aid and trauma medicine, learning how to treat combat injuries that might occur during rescue operations. She understood how to stabilize wounded personnel for transport, how to manage medical emergencies during flight, and how to coordinate with medical personnel to optimize casualty treatment. Her preparation extended to understanding enemy capabilities with disturbing thoroughness. Della knew the effective range and characteristics of every weapon system that insurgent forces might deploy against aircraft. She understood their tactical preferences, their communication methods, and their likely responses to different types of helicopter operations. This knowledge would prove crucial when conventional military intelligence failed. The most remarkable aspect of Della's preparation was its comprehensive nature. While other pilots specialized in specific areas of helicopter operations, she developed capabilities across the entire spectrum of combat aviation. Her skills ranged from technical systems operation through tactical planning to psychological warfare, creating a unique combination that military planners had never encountered. Nobody knew the extent of her preparation because nobody asked. Her superiors saw a transport pilot who maintained her aircraft well and completed assigned missions without problems. They couldn't imagine that she was developing capabilities that exceeded those of pilots with years of combat experience, preparing for operations that official doctrine insisted were impossible or unnecessary. As the weeks passed and her skills continued to develop, Della had hoped that someday her preparation would prove valuable. She had no way of knowing that in just 48 hours, every minute of training, every hour of study, and every tactical innovation would become the difference between survival and massacre for 920 soldiers trapped in the deadliest ambush in modern military history. The morning of September 15th dawned with deceptive beauty across FOB Phoenix. Clear skies stretched endlessly over the Afghan mountains, and the temperature promised to be moderate for the first time in weeks. It was the kind of day that made soldiers optimistic about missions, the kind of weather that encouraged confidence in operational planning. Major Harrison stood in the command center reviewing final preparations for Operation Desert Thunder, the largest ground assault mounted from Phoenix in over 6 months. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent forces had been consolidating in the Karabad Valley, a strategic corridor that connected several key supply routes. The operation was designed to disrupt their activities through a massive show of force, deploying 920 soldiers across multiple landing zones in a coordinated assault that would clear the entire valley system. It was an ambitious operation that required perfect coordination between ground forces, air support, and logistics elements. Captain Rodriguez had been assigned lead attack helicopter support, with Captain Thompson providing reconnaissance and battlefield coordination. Captain Williams would handle close air support for the primary assault force, while other pilots managed transportation and medical evacuation responsibilities. The operation represented months of planning and involved the largest commitment of resources that the base had made in recent memory. Della's assignment was predictably limited. She would provide supply support to forward operating locations, maintaining ammunition and medical supply levels for ground forces as they established control over captured territory. It was important work that required skilled navigation and reliable execution, but it kept her safely away from the primary combat operations where real tactical decisions would be made. The briefing lasted 2 hours and covered every aspect of the planned operation. Maps showed insertion points, rally locations, and contingency extraction sites throughout the valley system. Weather reports promised ideal flying conditions throughout the operational window. Intelligence assessments indicated that insurgent resistance would be moderate and disorganized, suggesting that the operation could achieve its objectives with minimal casualties. What the briefing didn't mention was information that contradicted the optimistic assessment. Della had been tracking communication intercepts that suggested much higher levels of insurgent coordination than official intelligence recognized. Her analysis of enemy movement patterns indicated preparation for a major defensive operation, not the scattered resistance that planners anticipated. Most disturbing, her terrain analysis showed that the planned insertion points were located in areas that offered perfect opportunities for large-scale ambushes. She had attempted to raise these concerns during preliminary mission planning, but her input was dismissed as excessive caution from someone without combat experience. The intelligence specialists had access to classified information sources that provided more complete pictures than transport pilots could develop, according to official reasoning. Her unauthorized analysis was considered interesting, but irrelevant to operational planning. As the briefing concluded and pilots dispersed to prepare their aircraft, Della felt the familiar weight of frustrated expertise. She possessed tactical knowledge that could potentially save lives, but institutional structures prevented that knowledge from influencing decisions. Her preparation had given her capabilities that exceeded many combat veterans, but those capabilities were dismissed because they came from someone assigned to support duties. The first helicopters lifted off at 0630 hours, carrying advanced reconnaissance teams to establish observation posts throughout the target area. Della watched from the flight line as her colleagues departed for missions that would test their skills under combat conditions, while she prepared for another routine supply run that would keep her safely behind friendly lines. Her Apache sat loaded with medical supplies and ammunition, configured for the transport role that had defined her entire deployment. The weapon systems were functional but loaded with minimal ordnance, enough for self-defense, but not for sustained combat operations. Her flight plan took her to rear area supply points where she would wait for requests from ground commanders ready to deliver materials but not to participate in tactical operations. As she completed pre-flight checks, Della noticed details that wouldn't appear in official reports, but troubled her tactical instincts. Radio traffic from reconnaissance elements indicated enemy activity levels that exceeded intelligence predictions. Ground commanders were reporting contact with organized resistance forces rather than the scattered insurgents that briefings had described. Most concerning, communication patterns suggested that insurgent forces were maneuvering to positions that offered tactical advantages over coalition insertion points. The first indication of serious problems came at 0745 hours, when reconnaissance elements reported heavy enemy contact near primary landing zone Alpha. What should have been a routine insertion of advance teams had turned into a significant firefight, with enemy forces demonstrating coordination and firepower that caught ground commanders by surprise. Radio traffic indicated casualties and requests for immediate fire support. By 0830 hours, the situation had deteriorated beyond anything that operational planners had anticipated. All three primary landing zones were under heavy enemy fire, with insertion teams pinned down and taking casualties. The enemy had prepared defensive positions that commanded all approaches to the valley floor, creating interlocking fields of fire that made helicopter operations extremely hazardous. What should have been a straightforward assault had become a complex rescue operation. The command center erupted into controlled chaos as staff officers scrambled to develop responses to a situation that hadn't appeared in any planning scenario. Radio communications carried increasingly desperate reports from ground units that found themselves trapped in prepared killing zones, facing enemy forces that had clearly anticipated the operation and prepared accordingly. Major Harrison's confident assessment of insurgent capabilities proved catastrophically wrong. Instead of scattered, poorly organized resistance, coalition forces faced a sophisticated defensive operation that had turned the entire valley into a carefully planned trap. The 920 soldiers who had confidently inserted that morning now found themselves fighting for survival against overwhelming odds in terrain that offered no escape. As reports continued to arrive describing the deteriorating tactical situation, Della realized that her unauthorized intelligence analysis had been accurate in ways that she wished it hadn't been. The patterns she had identified, the coordination she had detected, the tactical sophistication she had warned about, all of it was playing out exactly as she had feared. The question now was whether anyone would listen to her assessment of how to extract forces from a trap that official planning had insisted was impossible. At 09:15 hours, the full scope of the disaster became clear. Radio communications from the trapped ground forces painted a picture of tactical catastrophe that military planners had considered impossible. The 920 soldiers of Operation Desert Thunder were scattered across 3 landing zones, all of which had become killing fields commanded by enemy forces occupying superior defensive positions throughout the surrounding ridges. Primary Landing Zone Alpha held 340 soldiers pinned down in a depression that offered minimal cover from enemy fire originating from multiple directions. Secondary Landing Zone Bravo contained 380 soldiers, trapped on exposed terrain with no viable extraction routes. Landing Zone Charlie, initially considered the most secure, held 200 soldiers facing the heaviest resistance from enemy forces that had prepared elaborate defensive positions specifically designed to counter helicopter extraction attempts. The enemy had demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded every intelligence estimate. Their defensive positions were mutually supporting, their communications were coordinated, and their weapons placement showed professional military planning. Most critically, they had positioned anti-aircraft systems that made conventional helicopter extraction operations virtually impossible. Every approach route to the trapped forces was covered by overlapping fields of fire from weapons specifically chosen to counter Apache helicopters. Captain Rodriguez, leading the attack helicopter support, had made 3 attempts to establish fire suppression corridors for extraction operations. Each attempt had been driven off by coordinated enemy fire that demonstrated intimate knowledge of attack helicopter capabilities and vulnerabilities. His aircraft had taken multiple hits from small arms and light anti-aircraft weapons, forcing him to abort missions that might otherwise have been successful. Captain Thompson's reconnaissance flights had provided detailed intelligence on enemy positions, but that intelligence only confirmed what tactical analysts were beginning to understand. The insurgent forces had created a sophisticated trap that leveraged terrain advantages to neutralize coalition technological superiority. Conventional extraction methods were failing because the enemy had specifically prepared to counter them. The situation demanded unconventional solutions, tactics that hadn't been tested under combat conditions but might offer possibilities that conventional approaches couldn't achieve. As staff officers struggled to develop new extraction plans, Della approached Major Harrison with information that she hoped might change the tactical equation. "Sir," she said, interrupting a heated discussion between Harrison and his operations officer, "I've been analyzing the tactical situation, and I believe there's an extraction route that might work." Harrison looked up from the maps covering his desk, his expression showing the strain of commanding an operation that had gone catastrophically wrong. "Mitchell, this isn't the time for transport pilot input. We need combat-experienced aviators developing solutions to complex tactical problems." "Sir, I understand the tactical situation," Della persisted, unfolding the detailed terrain maps she'd been working on for months. "The enemy has prepared positions to counter conventional extraction approaches, but there's a route through the Eastern Canyon system that could provide access to all 3 landing zones without exposing aircraft to their primary defensive positions." The operations officer, Major Stevens, studied her maps with obvious skepticism. "Captain Mitchell, that route requires flying through terrain that's barely suitable for helicopters under ideal conditions. Under combat conditions, with enemy forces actively opposing the operation, it would be suicide." Della had anticipated this objection and was prepared to address it with detailed analysis that she developed through months of unauthorized preparation. Sir, the terrain is challenging, but manageable for pilots with advanced tactical training. The canyon walls would provide natural protection from most enemy fire positions, and the approach angles would allow for rapid insertion and extraction before enemy forces could coordinate effective responses. Advanced tactical training? Harrison's voice carried the particular tone reserved for subordinates who had exceeded appropriate boundaries. Mitchell, you're a transport pilot. You haven't received advanced tactical training, and you certainly haven't developed the combat experience necessary to assess the feasibility of complex extraction operations. The dismissal stung because it was partially accurate, but completely irrelevant. Della lacked official advanced tactical training, but her self-directed preparation had given her capabilities that exceeded those of many combat veterans. Her analysis was based on months of detailed study, practice sessions that had tested her skills under conditions approaching combat stress, and tactical understanding that she developed through comprehensive research into combat aviation operations. Sir, I've studied this terrain extensively, she said, maintaining professional composure despite her growing frustration. I've practiced the specific maneuvers that would be required for this extraction route, and I've analyzed enemy capabilities in detail. I believe this approach offers the best chance of successfully extracting our trapped forces. Major Stevens leaned back in his chair, his expression showing the patient condescension that Della had learned to recognize as institutional dismissal of unconventional ideas. Captain Mitchell, your enthusiasm is appreciated, but extraction operations of this complexity require pilots with extensive combat experience and specialized training in contested landing zone operations. Your skill set, while adequate for transport duties, doesn't extend to the kind of high-risk tactical flying that this situation demands. The conversation was developing exactly as Della had anticipated, but the stakes made her more persistent than usual. Men were dying while command staff debated the qualifications of pilots who might save them, and she possessed capabilities that could make the difference between rescue and massacre. Sir, with respect, I believe my qualifications are more extensive than my assignment suggests, she said, knowing that this statement would require explanations that might damage her military career. I've been conducting advanced tactical training during off-duty hours, studying combat aviation techniques, and developing skills specifically designed for high-risk operations in hostile territory. Harrison's expression shifted from irritation to concern, the kind of concern that suggested questions about psychological stability rather than tactical competence. Mitchell, are you telling me that you've been conducting unauthorized training exercises and developing tactics outside your assigned duties? The question carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Unauthorized tactical development could be interpreted as preparation for inappropriate activities, evidence of poor judgment, or indication of psychological problems that affected military reliability. Della realized that admitting her extensive preparation might end her military career even if her tactical assessment proved correct. Sir, I've been improving my aviation skills and studying tactical procedures that might prove valuable in emergency situations, she replied, choosing words carefully to minimize implications while maintaining honesty about her capabilities. That's exactly the kind of inappropriate focus that we've discussed before, Harrison said, his voice carrying final authority. Mitchell, your job is transport operations, not tactical planning. This extraction requires combat pilots with proven experience in contested operations, not logistics specialists with unauthorized tactical theories. As Harrison turned back to his maps, effectively ending the conversation, Della realized that institutional limitations had created a situation where tactical solutions could be dismissed, not because they were incorrect, but because they came from sources that official doctrine didn't recognize as legitimate. Her preparation had given her unique capabilities to address the current crisis, but those capabilities couldn't be utilized because they didn't fit established role definitions. The trapped soldiers had no idea that their potential rescue was being limited by bureaucratic concerns about appropriate qualifications and authorized tactical development. While staff officers continued searching for conventional solutions to an unconventional problem, time was running out for forces that needed someone willing to attempt operations that others considered impossible. By 10:30 hours, the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond salvage through conventional military operations. Radio communications from the 3 trapped landing zones carried increasingly desperate reports of ammunition shortages, mounting casualties, and enemy forces that were systematically tightening their positions around coalition forces. Medical personnel at FOB Phoenix prepared for casualties that exceeded their treatment capacity, while staff officers struggled with extraction scenarios that seemed to offer no viable solutions. Landing Zone Alpha reported 12 killed and 37 wounded, with enemy forces advancing steadily through defensive positions that couldn't be maintained without ammunition resupply. The ground commander, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, had been forced to consolidate his remaining effective troops into a perimeter barely large enough to maintain radio contact with base command. His requests for immediate extraction or fire support carried the particular urgency of an officer who understood that his position was becoming untenable. The situation at Landing Zone Bravo was even worse. Enemy forces had established positions that commanded all approaches to the trapped soldiers, creating interlocking fields of fire that prevented any movement beyond minimal defensive positions. Captain Walker, the senior ground commander at Bravo, reported 26 casualties and ammunition supplies that would last less than 2 hours under current consumption rates. His assessment of extraction possibilities was brutally realistic. Conventional helicopter approaches would result in aircraft losses without successful personnel recovery. Landing Zone Charlie faced the most sophisticated enemy preparations. The insurgent forces had constructed elaborate defensive works that suggested months of preparation specifically designed to counter coalition extraction operations. Major Thompson, commanding the ground forces at Charlie, reported that enemy positions included anti-aircraft weapons positioned to create overlapping coverage of all conventional approach routes. His tactical assessment indicated that standard extraction procedures would result in helicopter losses and minimal personnel recovery. The air support situation was equally grim. Captain Rodriguez had exhausted his ammunition load during 3 separate attempts to establish fire suppression corridors, achieving only temporary suppression of enemy positions before being driven off by coordinated anti-aircraft fire. His Apache had sustained damage that required immediate maintenance before it could return to combat operations, reducing available fire support by 1/3. Captain Thompson's reconnaissance aircraft provided continuous intelligence updates, but that intelligence only confirmed what tactical planners were beginning to understand. The enemy had created a sophisticated trap that leveraged terrain advantages and positioned firepower to neutralize coalition technological superiority. Every conventional approach to extraction had been anticipated and countered by defensive preparations that demonstrated professional military planning. Weather conditions remained ideal for helicopter operations, but ideal weather couldn't overcome tactical situations that made those operations impossible. The clear skies that had seemed promising during morning briefings now worked against coalition forces by providing enemy observers with perfect visibility to coordinate defensive fires against any extraction attempts. Major Harrison found himself commanding an operation that had transformed from routine assault to complex rescue mission without warning or preparation. His staff officers developed contingency plans as quickly as possible, but each scenario required capabilities that weren't immediately available or tactics that hadn't been tested under combat conditions. The standard military decision-making process was proving inadequate for situations that fell outside established operational parameters. The pressure extended beyond immediate tactical concerns to strategic implications that would affect military operations throughout the region. The loss of 920 soldiers would represent the single largest coalition casualty event of the entire conflict, a disaster that would have political ramifications extending far beyond military circles. Media attention would focus international scrutiny on military planning that had failed to anticipate obvious tactical vulnerabilities. At 11:15 hours, the situation received additional urgency from intelligence reports indicating that enemy forces were receiving reinforcements that would make extraction operations even more difficult. Intercepted communications suggested that insurgent leaders considered the trapped coalition forces to be a significant tactical victory, one worth investing additional resources to maintain. The window for successful extraction was closing rapidly as enemy capabilities continued to increase. Della monitored these developments from her assigned position in the logistics support area, her Apache loaded with supplies that couldn't be delivered to forces that couldn't be reached. She listened to radio traffic from the trapped units, hearing the steady degradation of tactical situations that she had predicted weeks earlier. Her unauthorized intelligence analysis had anticipated exactly this scenario, but that analysis remained irrelevant to operational planning because it came from inappropriate sources.
At 1,430 hours, Captain Della Mitchell's Apache emerged from the eastern canyon like an avenging angel, its rotor wash scattering dust and debris as she executed the most technically demanding extraction sequence ever attempted in combat conditions. Her aircraft carried 43 wounded soldiers from Landing Zone Alpha, men who had been written off as casualties just hours earlier. Behind her, the canyon route she had pioneered remained open, providing the first viable extraction corridor that enemy forces hadn't anticipated or prepared to counter. The rescue of Landing Zone Alpha had taken precisely 27 minutes from initial approach to final extraction, during which Della had demonstrated flying skills that redefined what military aviation specialists considered possible. Her approach through the canyon system had brought her Apache to within 50 meters of trapped ground forces without exposing the aircraft to a single enemy firing position. Utilizing terrain masking techniques that she had developed through months of unauthorized practice sessions, the extraction itself had required tactical innovations that weren't covered in any military manual. Della had positioned her Apache to provide suppressive fire while simultaneously conducting personnel recovery operations, using the aircraft's advanced sensor systems to coordinate ground movement while maintaining continuous fire support. Her precision with the 30mm cannon had neutralized enemy positions that had been pinning down coalition forces for hours, creating the tactical space necessary for successful evacuation operations. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, the ground commander at Alpha, had coordinated the extraction with professional competence despite wounds that would have incapacitated most officers. His radio communications with Della demonstrated the kind of trust that developed between combat veterans who understood each other's capabilities under extreme stress. When Martinez confirmed that all personnel were aboard her aircraft, his voice carried relief that transcended normal military communications protocols. Phoenix Base. This is Rescue 7. Della transmitted as her overloaded Apache struggled to gain altitude while exiting the canyon system. Landing Zone Alpha is clear. 43 personnel recovered, including 12 urgent surgical cases requiring immediate medical attention. The response from base command carried disbelief that gradually transformed into amazed recognition of what she had accomplished. Major Harrison's voice came through the radio with tones that Della had never heard from him before. Professional respect mixed with something approaching awe at tactical capabilities that had exceeded every prediction. Rescue 7. Confirm Alpha is clear. How did you manage extraction through that terrain under combat conditions? Della's response was characteristically professional despite the magnitude of her achievement. Base utilized Eastern Canyon approach to avoid enemy defensive positions. Terrain masking provided cover for tactical operations that wouldn't be feasible through conventional approach routes. As she guided her heavily loaded aircraft toward FOB Phoenix, Della was already planning the return mission to Landing Zone Bravo. The tactical situation there remained critical, but her successful extraction from Alpha had proven that unconventional approaches could achieve results that standard military doctrine considered impossible. More importantly, she had demonstrated that the extensive preparation that others had dismissed as inappropriate ambition was actually tactical capability that could save lives under combat conditions. The landing at Phoenix was unlike anything Della had experienced during her military career. Medical personnel rushed toward her Apache before the rotors had stopped turning, beginning triage procedures on casualties who represented successful rescue rather than tactical failure. Ground crews began immediate maintenance procedures to prepare her aircraft for return operations. Understanding that time remained critical for forces still trapped in the field, Major Harrison met her at the aircraft as casualties were being transferred to medical facilities. His expression showing the complex mixture of relief, amazement, and professional recalculation that occurred when institutional assumptions proved completely wrong. For months, he had dismissed Della's capabilities based on role limitations and physical assumptions that now appeared ridiculous in light of what she had accomplished. "Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying authority that now included respect rather than condescension. "That extraction was the most technically demanding operation I've ever witnessed. How long have you been developing those capabilities?" Della removed her flight helmet, her blonde hair matted with sweat from flying under combat stress that would have challenged the most experienced pilots. "Sir, I've been preparing for operations like this since my assignment to Phoenix. I believe that emergency situations might require capabilities beyond standard transport duties." Harrison studied her with eyes that were seeing her clearly for the first time since her arrival at the base. The small woman who had been dismissed as unsuitable for combat operations had just completed a rescue mission that male pilots with years of combat experience had declared impossible. Her technical flying skills, tactical planning, and performance under pressure had exceeded every measure that military planners use to evaluate combat aviation capabilities. "The canyon route you used," Harrison continued. "How did you know it would provide access to the landing zone without exposing your aircraft to enemy fire?" "Sir, I've been studying the terrain extensively during off-duty hours," Della replied, her voice steady despite exhaustion that came from sustained combat operations. "I identified several potential extraction routes that might prove valuable during emergency situations. The Eastern Canyon provided the best combination of concealment and tactical access for helicopter operations." The implications of her statement were staggering. While command staff had relied on standard intelligence assessments that proved completely inadequate, Della had developed tactical knowledge through personal initiative that provided solutions when official planning failed. Her unauthorized preparation had created capabilities that were now proving essential for saving lives that military doctrine had declared impossible to rescue. AS medical personnel completed casualty processing and reported that all recovered soldiers would survive their injuries. The tactical situation transformed from disaster management to successful rescue operations. Della's proof that extraction was possible through unconventional methods had changed the entire operational calculus, providing hope for forces at landing zones Bravo and Charlie that had been considered beyond help. Radio communications from the remaining trapped forces carried new energy as news of the successful Alpha extraction spread among ground commanders who had been preparing for last stands against overwhelming enemy forces. The psychological impact of successful rescue operations extended beyond immediate tactical advantages to restore confidence among troops who had been abandoned by conventional military planning. Della's achievement represented more than tactical success. It demonstrated that institutional limitations often prevented optimal utilization of available capabilities. Her months of dismissed preparation had created unique qualifications that proved essential when standard approaches failed, suggesting that military organizations might benefit from encouraging rather than restricting individual initiative in developing capabilities beyond assigned roles. As she prepared for return operations, to extract forces from landing zones Bravo and Charlie. Della understood that she had crossed a threshold that would define the rest of her military career. She was no longer the overlooked transport pilot who counted supplies while others flew dangerous missions. She had become the pilot who saved 920 soldiers when everyone else said it was impossible, proving that determination and preparation could overcome any limitation that others might impose.
At 16:30 hours, after Della had completed successful extractions from all 3 landing zones and safely delivered the final group of wounded soldiers to FOB Phoenix, she found herself standing in Major Harrison's office facing a tribunal that would determine her military future. The 920 soldiers she had rescued were receiving medical treatment, ammunition resupply, and hot meals, but her unauthorized actions had created command problems that extended far beyond tactical success. Colonel Richard sat behind Harrison's desk, his weathered face showing the complex mixture of administrative concern and professional admiration that occurred when brilliant tactical results emerged from serious breaches of military discipline. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes from the Inspector General's office occupied a chair to his right, reviewing files that documented every aspect of Della's unauthorized rescue operations. The formal nature of their presence suggested that her actions would have consequences extending far beyond local command decisions. "Captain Mitchell," Colonel Richards began, his voice carrying the authority of 25 years of military service. "Your actions today represent the most complex case of military discipline versus tactical effectiveness that I've encountered in my career. You disobeyed direct orders, violated operational security protocols, and conducted unauthorized combat operations that could have resulted in additional casualties and equipment losses." Della maintained military posture despite exhaustion that came from 6 hours of sustained combat flying under conditions that would have challenged the most experienced pilots. Her flight suit still carried the dust and cordite residue of operations that had redefined what individual aviators could accomplish under impossible circumstances. The contrast between her small physical presence and the magnitude of her tactical achievement created cognitive dissonance that military bureaucracy struggled to process. "However," Richards continued, "your unauthorized actions also resulted in the successful extraction of 920 soldiers who would otherwise have been casualties of the most significant tactical disaster in recent military history. Your technical flying skills and tactical innovations exceeded the capabilities of more experienced pilots with official qualifications that you lack." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes leaned forward, consulting documents that detailed every aspect of her military service record alongside after-action reports from the day's operations. "Captain Mitchell, military discipline exists for reasons that extend beyond individual situations. If every officer decided independently which orders to follow based on personal tactical assessments, military effectiveness would collapse into chaos rather than coordinated operations." The statement contained truth that Della couldn't dispute, but it also revealed institutional blindness that had nearly resulted in massive casualties among forces that could have been saved through more flexible approaches to individual initiative. Military discipline provided essential coordination, but rigid adherence to established procedures sometimes prevented optimal responses to situations that fell outside normal parameters. "Sir, I understand the importance of military discipline," Della replied, choosing her words carefully to acknowledge legitimate concerns while defending actions that had saved lives. "My decision to conduct unauthorized operations wasn't taken lightly. I assessed the tactical situation and concluded that conventional approaches would fail, resulting in casualties that might be prevented through unconventional methods." Colonel Richards studied her with eyes that had seen numerous cases where good intentions had led to poor decisions, but also with recognition that exceptional circumstances sometimes required exceptional responses. "Captain, explain how you developed the tactical capabilities that enabled today's successful operations. Your personnel file indicates transport pilot qualifications, but your performance demonstrated combat aviation skills that exceed many experienced attack helicopter pilots." This question had been inevitable, but it required Della to admit preparation activities that might be interpreted as evidence of inappropriate ambition or psychological problems affecting her military reliability. Her extensive self-directed training had created capabilities that proved essential during crisis situations, but that training fell outside established professional development channels. "Sir, I've been conducting advanced tactical training during off-duty hours since my assignment to Phoenix," she said, understanding that honesty might damage her career, but dishonesty would be worse. "I studied combat aviation techniques, practiced advanced maneuvers, and developed tactical knowledge that I believed might prove valuable during emergency situations." Hayes made notes on documents that would become permanent parts of her service record, creating official documentation of activities that had previously existed only in her personal preparation efforts. "Captain, this unauthorized tactical development represents a significant deviation from your assigned duties. Why did you feel authorized to exceed the boundaries of your professional role?" The question struck at fundamental issues of individual initiative versus institutional control that affected military organizations throughout their hierarchies. Della's preparation had created unique capabilities, but those capabilities had developed outside official channels designed to ensure that individual development aligned with organizational needs and professional standards. "Sir, I understand the importance of military discipline," Della replied, choosing her words carefully to acknowledge legitimate concerns while defending actions that had saved lives. "My decision to conduct unauthorized operations wasn't taken lightly. I assessed the tactical situation and concluded that conventional approaches would fail, resulting in casualties that might be prevented through unconventional methods." Colonel Richards studied her with eyes that had seen numerous cases where good intentions had led to poor decisions, but also with recognition that exceptional circumstances sometimes required exceptional responses. "Captain, explain how you developed the tactical capabilities that enabled today's successful operations. Your personnel file indicates transport pilot qualifications, but your performance demonstrated combat aviation skills that exceed many experienced attack helicopter pilots." This question had been inevitable, but it required Della to admit preparation activities that might be interpreted as evidence of inappropriate ambition or psychological problems affecting her military reliability. Her extensive self-directed training had created capabilities that proved essential during crisis situations, but that training fell outside established professional development channels. "Sir, I've been conducting advanced tactical training during off-duty hours since my assignment to Phoenix," she said, understanding that honesty might damage her career, but dishonesty would be worse. "I studied combat aviation techniques, practiced advanced maneuvers, and developed tactical knowledge that I believed might prove valuable during emergency situations." Hayes made notes on documents that would become permanent parts of her service record, creating official documentation of activities that had previously existed only in her personal preparation efforts. "Captain, this unauthorized tactical development represents a significant deviation from your assigned duties. Why did you feel authorized to exceed the boundaries of your professional role?" The question struck at fundamental issues of individual initiative versus institutional control that affected military organizations throughout their hierarchies. Della's preparation had created unique capabilities, but those capabilities had developed outside official channels designed to ensure that individual development aligned with organizational needs and professional standards. "Sir, I understand the importance of military discipline," Della replied, choosing her words carefully to acknowledge legitimate concerns while defending actions that had saved lives. "My decision to conduct unauthorized operations wasn't taken lightly. I assessed the tactical situation and concluded that conventional approaches would fail, resulting in casualties that might be prevented through unconventional methods." Colonel Richards studied her with eyes that had seen numerous cases where good intentions had led to poor decisions, but also with recognition that exceptional circumstances sometimes required exceptional responses. "Captain, your actions represent both the best and worst aspects of military leadership. Your technical competence, tactical innovation, and moral courage under extreme circumstances exemplify the highest standards of military service. Your disregard for command authority and unauthorized tactical operations violate fundamental principles of military discipline. The formal language carried implications that extended beyond immediate disciplinary action to questions about her continued military service. Della had expected this moment since her decision to ignore direct orders, but the magnitude of her tactical success hadn't eliminated the institutional problems created by her unauthorized actions. However, Richards continued, your unauthorized actions also resulted in the successful extraction of 920 soldiers who would otherwise have been casualties of the most significant tactical disaster in recent military history. Your technical flying skills and tactical innovations exceeded the capabilities of more experienced pilots with official qualifications that you lack. Captain Mitchell, effective immediately, you're being reassigned to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, where your unique combination of tactical innovation and technical competence will be properly utilized. You'll receive official training in capabilities you've already demonstrated under combat conditions, and you'll serve in roles that match your proven abilities rather than arbitrary limitations. The assignment represented transformation that exceeded every expectation Della had maintained about her military career.
6 months after Operation Desert Thunder, Captain Della Mitchell stood in the briefing room of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The Night Stalker's patch on her shoulder carried weight that her previous transport pilot insignia had never possessed. But more importantly, when she spoke during mission planning sessions, every person in the room listened with the attention reserved. For proven combat leaders, the mission briefing covered a hostage rescue operation in Somalia that would test every skill she had developed through months of unauthorized preparation and proven during that decisive day in Afghanistan. Complex terrain, sophisticated enemy defenses, and time-critical extraction requirements created challenges that conventional aviation doctrine struggled to address. But Della had spent her career preparing for operations that others considered impossible. The Eastern approach offers our best infiltration route, she explained to the assembled team, pointing to terrain features on satellite imagery that showed remarkable similarity to the Afghan valleys where she had first proven her capabilities. Enemy defensive positions are oriented toward conventional helicopter approaches, but this canyon system provides concealment and tactical surprise that could enable successful penetration of their security perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, her new commanding officer, nodded approvingly. Morrison had requested Della's transfer to his unit specifically because of her proven ability to develop tactical solutions for operations that defeated standard military approaches. The 160th Regiment specialized in missions that required exactly the kind of innovative thinking that she had demonstrated through unauthorized channels. Mitchell, you'll lead the extraction element, Morrison announced, assigning her operational responsibility that would have been inconceivable during her previous assignment. Your experience with unconventional extraction techniques and complex terrain navigation makes you the optimal choice for this mission profile. The assignment represented complete transformation from her previous role limitations. Instead of being excluded from important missions because of perceived inadequacies, she was being selected for critical operations because of proven capabilities that had redefined institutional understanding of individual potential. As the briefing concluded, and team members dispersed to prepare their aircraft, Della reflected on the journey that had brought her from dismissed transport pilot to elite special operations aviator. Her unauthorized preparation had created capabilities that proved essential during crisis situations. But more importantly, her willingness to risk career consequences for moral imperatives had demonstrated character that military leadership valued above conventional qualifications. The ripple effects of her actions extended far beyond individual career advancement. Military aviation training programs had incorporated tactical innovations that she had developed through personal initiative, ensuring that future pilots would receive official instruction and capabilities that she had been forced to develop independently. Professional development policies had been modified to encourage, rather than restrict, individual initiative in expanding capabilities beyond assigned role limitations. Her story had become required study material at military leadership schools, not because of her tactical innovations, but because of her demonstration that institutional limitations often reflected bureaucratic convenience rather than actual capability assessments. Her willingness to challenge established assumptions about gender, physical size, and role appropriateness had forced military organizations to reconsider how they evaluated and utilized individual potential. The psychological impact of her achievement resonated throughout military aviation communities where other pilots, particularly women, had faced similar dismissive attitudes about their combat potential. Her proof that determination and preparation could overcome any institutional limitation provided inspiration for individuals who had been told that their aspirations exceeded their capabilities. During pre-flight preparations for the Somalia mission, Della encountered Captain Sarah Williams, a young pilot who had requested assignment to special operations after reading about the Desert Thunder rescue. Williams represented the next generation of military aviators who understood that individual limitations existed primarily in other people's expectations rather than actual capability. Captain Mitchell, Williams said as they conducted equipment checks, "I wanted to thank you for proving that size doesn't determine strength. Your example gave me the confidence to pursue special operations training despite people telling me I wasn't suited for combat aviation." The comment reminded Della that her most important achievement wasn't tactical innovation or individual career advancement, but demonstration that artificial limitations could be overcome through preparation, determination, and moral courage. Her refusal to accept others' definitions of her potential had created opportunities, not just for herself, but for countless others who faced similar dismissive attitudes. As her Apache lifted off into the African dawn, beginning another mission that military planners had initially considered too dangerous for conventional approaches. Della thought about the letter she had written to her sister before the Desert Thunder operation. In it, she had tried to explain why some things were worth risking career consequences, why proving capability sometimes required defying authority, and why individual moral courage was more important than institutional approval. Now, 6 months later, she understood that her real victory hadn't been saving 920 soldiers, though that remained the achievement she was most proud of. Her real victory had been changing institutional thinking about potential, capability, and the difference between following orders and serving higher purposes. The mission ahead would test every skill she had developed and prove once again that impossible was often just another word for untried. Her Apache disappeared into the morning sky, carrying weapons, determination, and proven capability toward another group of people who needed someone willing to attempt what others considered impossible. Some days, being underestimated was the perfect camouflage for exceeding every expectation. Today was one of those days that as she settled into combat formation with her team, Della smiled at the familiar feeling of proving conventional wisdom wrong. The small woman who had been told she was too weak, too cautious, too much of a liability for combat operations was now leading special operations missions that required exactly the kind of innovative thinking and moral courage that institutional bureaucracy had tried to suppress. The radio crackled with final mission coordination, and Della's voice joined the professional communications that would guide another impossible rescue toward successful completion. Behind her, the sunrise illuminated terrain that would soon witness another demonstration that individual determination could overcome any limitation that others might impose. Her legacy wasn't just in the soldiers she had saved or the tactical innovations she had developed, but in the proof that preparation meeting opportunity creates transformation, and that the most underestimated warriors often become the ones who save everyone else. The mission was just beginning, but she already knew how it would end, with everyone coming home safely. Because that's what happened when people stopped accepting limitations and started exceeding expectations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.